Okay. "51 years ago, the armies of Egypt and Syria launched a surprise attack on Israeli forces in the Sinai Desert and Golan Heights. It was on this very day of Yom Kippur in 1973. Israel suffered terrible losses, especially in those initial days. American Jews awakened to war. Rabbis hurriedly adjusted their Yom Kippur messages. Israeli soldiers on the front lines were ordered to break their fasts. Reservists' names were read from the pulpit, and in one synagogue, a young man stood when his name was called. His father embraced him and refused to let go. The rabbi descended from the bima and quietly said, 'My friend, your son's place is not here on this holy day.' I remember vividly arriving at the synagogue that morning to find a swastika painted on the front door. I was shaken. Even so, we had learned about the legends of Israel's bravado and its six-day war success in Hebrew school. So I had confidence from that very first day that Israel would be victorious, despite unimaginable odds. How could they fail with Golda Meir and Moshe Dayan at the helm? I believed Israel would prevail, quickly and decisively. The war lasted for nearly 3 terrible weeks. In the end, and in part because of an American airlift of supplies, Israel pushed the Egyptians beyond the Suez Canal and the Syrians from the Golan. Nearly 2,700 Israelis were killed and over 7,000 injured. The Egyptian and Syrian war dead were estimated in the tens of thousands. Our enemies attacked us on the holiest day of the year. We, however, persevered. Or this is how we like to tell the story. This is how we like to hear the tale. The truth, however, is not always as we tell it. The truth is far more complicated. Myth is neat and tidy. They are the stories we tell children. History, however, is messy. The Yom Kippur War was, in fact, a terrible military blunder. Israel's leaders were not as surprised as we like to believe. The Mossad had clear evidence that Egypt's attack was imminent. Golda Meir and Israel's leaders hesitated to call up all the reserves. Moshe Dayan, in particular, was complacent. Others were overconfident. The secret listening devices that Israeli commandos had risked their lives to install in Egypt and that would have given Israel the exact timing of the attack were not turned on for fear of being detected. Israel's leaders were blinded by arrogance and even at times negligence. Had they called up the reserves a few days earlier, the tragic costs to Israel would have been far less. Soldiers lost their lives because their leaders delayed. I know, we don't like to say such things out loud. We prefer to idealize our heroes. We mythologize the past. Truth-telling, however, is how we better ourselves and learn from past mistakes. Yet in many ways, it seems that we don't learn from our mistakes. On Simchat Torah morning last year, we once again awoke to the horrific news that Israel had again been invaded, again on one of our holy festival days, this time by Hamas. Before anyone had time to respond, over 1,200 Israelis were slaughtered, with many of them mutilated, burned, tortured, and raped, both before and after death. Over 250 Israelis were taken hostage to Gaza. Once again, we learned afterwards that Israeli officials had intelligence that could have prevented this massacre, or at least have allowed them to defend against it, but did not act on it. Once again, Israel's leaders were blinded by arrogance and negligence, and both Israelis and Palestinians continue to pay the price. In Israel, the trauma of the Yom Kippur War is still discussed, and the mistakes that were made are openly debated.
The Agranat Commission, established soon after the war, investigated the debacle and insisted the Israel Defense Force, or IDF, Chief of Staff David Elazar be dismissed. Mass protests forced Prime Minister Golda Meir and Defense Minister Moshe Dayan to resign. We want Israel to fit neatly into our storytelling, so we don't talk about it. And so, on this Yom Kippur, I am thinking more about our inability to speak about past mistakes rather than the mistakes themselves. I'm thinking more about our unwillingness to speak uncomfortable truths, most especially about what we hold dear. Reckoning with the past in an honest way that confronts the ugliness and evils of our historic wrongs is the only way we become a better nation. We think the notion that acknowledging past wrongs diminishes us, when in fact it elevates us. Just because these facts make us uncomfortable is no reason to shy away from airing them. That's exactly when we should be talking about them. Sure, it might make you uncomfortable and might even produce feelings of guilt, but that's a good thing, because guilt is the feeling of the soul that wants to make amends and do better. Guilt is not debilitating, it is empowering. It is about the soul's realization that it has fallen short. Until we acknowledge the other ugly truths standing before us, we cannot better ourselves. And unless Israel acknowledges its ugly truths, they will not learn from them, and therefore cannot ensure that Israel lives up to its democratic ideals. In the mouths of Israel's current leaders, democracy has become not a bedrock foundational principle, but merely a useful tool to create the modern Jewish state. I wonder about our inability to confront this truth. The truth is, Prime Minister Netanyahu abuses his authority to remain in power. Many of the lawmakers in the current ruling coalition represent views that are an anathema to the values we cherish, namely pluralism and tolerance. They do not respect Reform Jews, women, LGBTQ+ Israelis, or neighboring Muslims. Many current coalition members see democratic elections as a tool to foist their fundamentalist worldview on others. They do not view democracy as a principle by which to organize their lives and protect the rights of those with whom they disagree. Yet we are reluctant to criticize Israel. AIPAC, the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, and the Defender of Israel in the US Congress, studiously avoids offering public criticisms of Netanyahu's government. It offers lukewarm platitudes applauding Israel's vibrant internal debates, while reserving fire only for Israel's external threats. But what of the organization's arguments that it is our shared democratic values that bind America to Israel and that guarantees America's continued support of Israel's defense? We fear that our truth-telling will make common cause with Israel's enemies and our anti-Semitic haters. We worry that our critiques will further loosen the already weak bonds our children feel toward Israel. We deflect and say things like, Israel is fighting against countless enemies and not just those on its borders. Or, can you believe the double standard the United Nations applies to Israel? Or, I'm an American. I don't live in Israel, so I have no business speaking out against her policies or government. We turn away from the uncomfortable. Instead of confronting today's ugly truths, we find solace in our myths and rewrite our stories. When the State of Israel was established, its first Prime Minister, David Ben-Gurion, authored its Declaration of Independence. That document states, "The state of Israel will be based on freedom, justice, and peace as envisaged by the prophets of Israel. It will ensure complete equality of social and political rights to all its inhabitants, irrespective of religion, race, or sex. It will guarantee freedom of religion, conscience, language, education, and culture." But those beautiful and inspiring words
never went any further. Ben-Gurion resisted attempts to call a constitutional convention and enshrined these words as law. And who stood in opposition to the Ben-Gurion we so often idealize? Menachem Begin. He argued and lost for the need to write a constitution that would guarantee Israel's democracy. Begin said, "We have learned that an elected parliamentary majority can be an instrument in the hands of a group of rulers and act as camouflage for their tyranny." Begin rightly believed that the majority can have anti-democratic impulses. He understood that democracies are not so much about majority rule, but instead about ensuring the rights of all citizens. They are about protecting minorities with as much vigor as rulers. Today, and for the past 9 months or so, there are tens of thousands of Israelis protesting Netanyahu's government's handling of the Gaza war. They stand in what the Tel Aviv municipality has now renamed Democracy Square. The majority of Israelis understand that the complete eradication of Hamas is a pipe dream and support any and all compromises necessary to bring home the remaining hostages, dead and alive. Last year at this time, protesters were arguing against Netanyahu's so-called judicial reforms, arguing that they undermine Israeli democracy. A significant percentage of Israelis, including those from the right and the left, secular and religious, Air Force pilots and leading scientists, have all participated in these protests week after week. Many of these protesters have literally wrapped themselves in Israeli flags. They see their protests as expressions of their patriotism. 1 year later, we are only at the beginning of understanding and internalizing the implications of the magnitude of the October 7th attack, the colossal failure of the military, the total malfunction of the intelligence apparatus, and the sitting government's inability to deter, prevent, and react immediately and fully to the attack. As with the Yom Kippur War, future investigations will reveal how this could have happened and might have been prevented. In retrospect, one thing is already clear: the overwhelming national feeling of vulnerability. 1 year later, Israel and the Jewish world are confronting a reality in which Israel faces a multi-front war backed by an Iranian war machine. Many Israelis are left doubting whether a total victory, including a complete eradication of Hamas, is even possible. 1 year later, Israeli society has proven its resilience. In the absence of effective governmental leadership, civil society and ordinary citizens stepped up to organize, mobilize, and provide for all needs, from military to medical to social to anything and everything one can imagine. This remains a clear and present reminder of the self-sacrificing spirit that is at the foundation of the Zionist ethos. Now, 1 year later, we are again witnessing deep divisions in Israeli society. We are also seeing very different understandings of Zionism. On the one hand, there are those who regard themselves as modern-day pioneers working to rebuild their destroyed communities. On the other hand, there are those who consider this to be an apocalyptic or messianic moment, not unlike the Six-Day War, and a harbinger for the resettlement of Gaza by Jewish settlers and the de jure annexation of all of the West Bank into Israel, regardless of international law. 1 year later, Israeli culture has been overflowing with art, song, and poetry, as Israelis strive to comprehend and heal from the trauma of October 7th. In this past year, there has been a powerful display of Israeli Judaism, using our ancient wisdom to express through music and poetry all the emotions since October 7th and through the war. Likewise, serious Jewish legal discussions have arisen over the importance of two of Judaism's most important mitzvot, saving a life and the obligation to redeem captives. 1 year later,
Israeli society faces deep social, cultural, religious, and political divisions. It now seems clear that prioritizing the hostages is the largest dividing line in Israeli society. Those who do prioritize the hostages are accused of being traitors and worse. There continues to be great skepticism, anger, and a deep sense of distrust toward the government regarding the motives of various coalition members, chiefly the Prime Minister, in not moving as soon as possible to get the hostages home as a top priority. 1 year later, Israel still faces dangerous threats from Hamas, from Hezbollah, and from Iran. 1 year later, Israelis are still feeling traumatized. 1 year later, many more are becoming aware of the enormous damage in Gaza, the high toll of Palestinian civilian deaths, and the dire humanitarian crisis there. 1 year later, Netanyahu's coalition is still in power with few signs of collapse and new elections. 1 year later, hostages are still in captivity and time is running out before they all die. 1 year later, Israel is not the same country as it was before. I find hope in those who have put their country and their society above themselves. I find hope in those who continue to protest and rally to bring their loved ones home. And I find hope in those who understand that two nations, two peoples, exist between the river and the sea, and that no peace will come until that truth is universally recognized and accepted. 1 year later, I find hope in our continued perseverance as a people and in our commitment as a Jewish people to take care of one another. One final true story. When the Yom Kippur War broke out, a young Leonard Cohen, who wrote the Hallelujah song that is so familiar to many of us, jumped on a plane. He felt called to be with Israel in its pain. He traveled to the front lines of the Sinai Desert with a few musicians and performed impromptu concerts for the soldiers, many of whom later reported they believed this would be the last songs they would ever hear. They thought their lives were lost. His concerts were not widely publicized, but the soldiers who attended and who survived the war remember them to this day. There he wrote, "Who by Fire," a song based on the High Holy Day prayer Unetana Tokav. Let us proclaim the power of this day. On Rosh Hashanah, this is written. On the fast of Yom Kippur, this is sealed. Who will live and who will die? Cohen reimagines the prayer of his childhood and sings, and who by fire, who by water, and who by brave ascent, and who by accident, who in solitude, who in this mirror, who by his lady's command, who by his own hand, who in mortal chains, who in power, and who, shall I say, is calling? Indeed, who shall I say is calling? This Yom Kippur, I pray that each one of us answers that call to stand up for an Israel we can believe in, willing to confront the truth even when it doesn't live up to the myth we so love to hear and tell. I pray that we allow ourselves to criticize Israel's government and policies when they don't live up to our values, even as we love and embrace the land and her people. And most of all, I pray that peace comes soon for Israel and her neighbors, for the remaining hostages and their families, and for all of us. Oseh shalom bimromav, hu ya'aseh shalom. Aleinu v'al kol Yisrael, v'al kol yoshvei tevel, v'imru. Amen. May the Holy One of Blessing bless us, Israel, and all inhabitants of the earth with everlasting peace. Gemar Chatima Tova. May you and your loved ones be sealed for a year of goodness, joy, blessing, and most of all, peace.